All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with some opening comments and just go over some housekeeping items as we wait for everyone else to join. Thank you all again for joining today's session. Just a quick introduction of myself for those that I haven't interacted with. My name is Nikki Kazahaya, one of the SafeGraph community managers here. See a lot of familiar names from the SafeGraph community in this session that are attending. Always like to mention if you'd like to invite your peers and colleagues, I've posted a link in the chat that you're welcome to share. For those that aren't super familiar with the community, it's a free Slack community for data enthusiasts. You get access to our support team. You get to share your work and connect with others in the data science community. So certainly recommend joining. And also moving forward, we will ask that anyone wanting to attend future events in our event programming be a part of the SafeGraph community as well. So I'd like to also extend an offer. So if anyone is new to SafeGraph and feels like they would benefit from an onboarding call, I'm certainly happy to get that on the calendar. We usually like to go over how to download your first data set and get you oriented with some of the resources that we have here at SafeGraph. So I've dropped my email address below. Also very active on Slack, so feel free to drop me a line on either of those platforms and we will get that arranged. Just looking forward, a couple of housekeeping items. We do have another event coming up this week, Thursday, July 29th, 3 p.m. Pacific or 6 p.m. Eastern. It's going to be the second event of a recent series that SafeGraph has recently started called the Knowledge Series. This week's Knowledge Series will go over some best practices for working with large data sets. We're actually going to be bringing in one of our own team members, James Kyle from SafeGraph Engineering, to talk about some common approaches, strategies that will maximize project success. So also we'll drop the link for that as well. Give me 1 second. Awesome. So before I introduce our guest speaker for today, I always like to go over some guidelines for how these events usually run. Certainly want the session to be interactive as possible. So I think what we'll do, Jeremy is going to start off with some questions and some discussion on the front end. So if you would like to respond or make any comments, certainly raise your hand or dump them in the chat. I'm happy to unmute you. And then once Jeremy starts in on the presentation, I'll go ahead and mute everyone. However, if questions come to mind, certainly feel free to interject and interrupt. We'd love to have live questions. If you feel comfortable, you're more than welcome to share your audio and video as well. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jeremy. Jeremy is currently a researcher at the Harvard Economic Diplomacy Initiative at the Belfer Center. He has worked at the MIT Media Lab exploring how to fundamentally restructure the US economy, both at the Initiative on the Digital Economy, focused on ensuring the future of work is inclusive and equitable for all, and also at the Technology and Public Purpose, or TAP Initiative at the Belfer Center at Harvard, evaluating policies, projects, and programs aimed at combating tech wrongs. Jeremy is now joining Google's Open Web team to forge partnerships to make the web more accessible while working on privacy policy issues. So thank you again, Jeremy, for hopping on today. I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to you.
Thanks so much for that intro, Nikki. I'm really excited to be chatting with all of you today about American inequality and ways that I have explored data visualization to focus on social change and inequality issues. But before we get too much deeper into it, I want to give you a little bit of background on me, just so we know who we're talking to here. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. That's the photo on the top left there. That is still exactly how Brooklyn looks, just full of hipsters across the Brooklyn Bridge. And after graduating college, I went straight to working at the Federal Reserve to focus on forecasting and crisis readiness issues. And so that's a photo of the gold vault there being buried into the bedrock of Manhattan. And our team was really focused on looking at finding black swan events, trying to figure out where the next large financial crisis was coming from. A really big part of what I did at the Fed was I helped found the New York Fed's Income Inequality Working Group and trying to get the Fed to focus a bit more on this challenge that's really emerging in America. That brought me to grad school, where I'm in a dual degree program at MIT Sloan and the Harvard Kennedy School, where on the MIT side, I focused a lot on data science and data analytics, and on the Kennedy side, focused a lot on US income inequality and US policy issues. One of the summers that I had in grad school, I worked for the robotics team at Amazon, which is a crazy place. And we can talk about that, definitely not on this series, but we can follow up on another time. But that really, I think, exposed me to, firsthand a lot of these inequality issues of working at this, very intense, technologically developed company at the same time that you're working with a lot of, low income wage workers. So after that summer, I founded two nonprofits, two organizations, Let's Get Set, which helps low income families get access to certain tax credits that they're owed, and NOLO, or No One Left Offline, that helps folks get connected to the internet, because you can develop all the best policies in America, but if you can't access them through the internet, it's sort of all for naught. But kind of through the panoply of these things, I ended up writing a lot and researching a lot and digging into a lot of data, and sort of brought all of that together in this blog called American Inequality that I love for. We'll talk about some of the research and the data and the insights there, and sort of the work that sort of emerged from all of this. So let's start off with the sort of main takeaways or the main insights about what the blog is. So American Inequality really tries to focus on inequality topics that tend to get less coverage. As many of us know, inequality is really growing in America. But there are these, certain challenges that people aren't looking at enough, inequality in food deserts, in life expectancy, in mental health. And so this is trying to shed light on those topics that really aren't seeing enough traction. Second, I really try and use data visualizations to highlight US regional divides. Inequality is about communities that have and communities that have not. And so as we'll see in sort of this presentation, we'll look at a lot of maps that show this. Third, I always try and integrate stories into every article to empathize the data and make the inequalities more human. As many of us know, and in this data space, data can often feel sterile or inhuman. And so I want to integrate stories of real people who actually suffer, from these challenges, to make sure that we know that this isn't just a faceless mass. And last, every article also has a path forward. So I got the feedback very early on that people would read these articles and feel depressed at the end. And so this is working to make sure that people feel as though there's hopeful ways for us to address some of these inequalities and actually make for real social change. So the main takeaways, just to start off with this, and we'll come back to this at the end, is that inequality is deeply intertwined with many confounding forces. So that's education and healthcare, taxes, gender, race. It's really difficult to look at inequality across one dimension. And so this series really tries to make sure that it does justice to the fact that you can't really disaggregate one piece from another. Second, data is really critical for knowing the exact towns, communities, and regions where inequality is the greatest. I want to make sure that in this path forward section, we're designing for communities and instead of just society or a certain group, but really knowing that this community in Mississippi along the river, this group of people really needs certain action. And then last is that it's important to remain hopeful in this work, that as large and interconnected as some of these challenges are, that there's ways to actually be combating a lot of these inequalities, and along many dimensions, inequality has been decreasing in certain ways. So the tricky part with this is figuring out what the trade-offs are and who the stakeholders need to be in order for those solutions to be most effective. So enough talking, as Nikki mentioned, I wanted to start off with a question to the group, and someone can either put this in the chat or raise their hands, but I'd love if someone could wager what they think that this is a map of. There are no right or wrong answers, but there is a correct answer for this one.
We have a couple of guesses. We have one in the chat. Education levels, Wi-Fi. I'm going to allow one member from our group to talk to guess. Go ahead, Zan.
Yeah, I think maybe it's like white population versus non-white population percentage. And I think in blue regions, there might be more white population.
It's a fascinating guess because I see there's a lot of, COVID, household income, healthcare, wealth inequality sort of being thrown out in the chat. So the answer is that it's income inequality in America, which, as the panelists sort of guess, that is highly correlated also with race in America. So this shows, the $110,000 gap between median income household income across counties. So Loudoun County in Virginia is the wealthiest county in America, and Jackson County in Mississippi is the poorest county at 20,000. So I think if you overlaid race on this, you might see this, as well as some of those other variables that we see in the chat: healthcare, COVID, wealth, things like that. So we're going to do another one of these. Any other guesses? Another brave soul want to chime in?
So we have one, college education. That's an interesting guess. Any other guesses?
COVID, death rates, Hispanic population number. So the answer for this one, I am moving back to New York City, and so I'm very much looking at rent prices, and this is the household spending on rent on a 2-bedroom, and what percentage of your income you are spending on rent. So you see folks, who are spending up to 65% of their income on rent. Other folks are spending, 10%. And so, this map we can see here, the West and the Southwest in particular, parts of Florida, along the Texas border areas where folks are spending, really high percentages. And we'll get into this later, but HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Affairs, recommends you only spend 30% of your income on housing. So a lot of areas are really in dire straits here. So as many data folks on this call are also probably curious about where does your data come from. So I really like to rely on primary sources here. So that's large federal government agencies. One of the amazing things about this push for digital government strategies in the last 5-10 years has meant that there are way more publicly accessible databases from these agencies. And so I basically have been combing through all their different portals to download sort of their sources. And that's where most of this data comes from, if not all. And then the visualizations themselves, I use Python and R often to create initial maps to figure out where some of these inequalities are. I use that for looking at some of these correlations as well, and figuring out some of these forces that move together. And then I use data wrapper to make those maps interactive. So every map also has a link, so you can scroll over and zoom in and say, hey, what's going on in this part of Colorado? Hey, what's going on in North Dakota? So I'm now going to spend the rest of this time going through a few of the different inequality topics that I've explored in American inequality, and definitely jump in with any questions here, but sharing some of the insights because I think it's important to understand this data so that way we can think about what some of these solutions might be for addressing them. So the first article that I wrote was about life expectancy and inequality, and how America is actually seeing the largest gap in life expectancy across regions in the last 40 years. So that means that people in parts of North Dakota are living to be 67 on average, while folks in Colorado are living to be 87. So you see this 20-year gap across regions. That's the highest that it has been in the last 4 decades. And so the chart on the right shows just how correlated that is. I think it's about a 71% correlation between life expectancy and household income. So the wealthier county that you are born into, by just the random chance, the more likely it is that you are going to live longer. So when you dig into that county in North Dakota, about 80% of the population there, it's called Oglala Lakota County, is Native American. So you have really high rates of suicide, alcoholism, poor access to healthcare, poor access to government services. So once you sort of start disaggregating some of this information, you're able to figure out what those challenges are, so you can think about what the solutions are. So, in that path forward section for this article, I talk about, what we can do to reduce costs of healthcare and reduce specific causes of death, so heart disease and stuff like that as well. I think that's particularly important, you know, in light of that chart on the left that I developed, which is, you know, the healthcare costs per capita. So, you know, the US has, you know, while we like to top the charts in many ways, you definitely don't want to do it when it comes to healthcare costs. So the US has much higher healthcare costs when you think compared to other developed OECD nations, and yet we don't actually have higher life expectancy than these nations. So we're spending more without actually getting more results. And life expectancy really, you know, it has improved over, you know, the last, you know, 35, 40 years, as you can see from the chart on the right. But there's still a lot of progress that we need to be making, particularly as, you know, suicides increase, drug overdoses increase, you know, because of some of these epidemics that we're seeing. Food deserts and inequality was a really fascinating one to dig into, because the area that I actually live in, Cambridge, was a food desert up until very recently when a new supermarket, affordable supermarket, came in. And so this one was you know, really interesting to dig into, because about 24 million Americans live in food deserts, and 54 million Americans are food insecure, which is really just astounding, you know, as we think about America as like being a very, you know, developed and wealthy nation, to have such a large percentage of our population being food insecure. And for those who don't know, food insecurity is basically two different sort of levers of the same challenge, which is you could be food insecure if you live in an area with no supermarket, or you could be food insecure if you live in an area where the only supermarket is a Whole Foods, where, you know, the prices are way too exorbitant for you to be affording, you know, $4 avocados. And so it's effectively as though there's no supermarket available to you. And so you can see, you know, Black families as well are twice as likely to live in food deserts as white families. So you can see, you know, those confounding forces of race and food inequality in America. So some of the, you know, solutions that we can look at for there are increasing the budget for SNAP, which is, you know, food stamps, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So making sure that low-income families that qualify this are actually able to afford foods, and increase access to new market tax credits. So those are federal tax credits that allow, you know, social service type of, or, you know, buildings like banks or supermarkets or things like that to actually show up in some of these communities where you're really struggling. Because, you know, if you look at that chart on the left around American obesity, so many of these, you know, the food options there are, you know, McDonald's and Waffle House and things like that, so unhealthy food options. And here we really want to make sure that we're providing tax credits to the, you know, types of healthier food options for families to get access to. Internet access and inequality. So this is one that has become very near and dear to my heart. So according to the FCC, 21 million Americans and 10 million school-age children do not have access to the internet. Some estimates actually put that number closer to 42 million because of the way that the FCC actually measures some of these regions. They'll say that if a census block has, if there's one house in the census block that has internet access, then all the families do. And the FCC is actually, you know, sort of under attack from Congress for measuring this way. So in the next 2 or 3 years, we should expect that data measurement to change. But, you know, if you look at the chart on the right, we again see this intense relationship between household income and those with internet. So if you know, are born into a county where the median household income is $35,000, you have a coin flip chance of having any internet connection at all. So again, you know, in a very developed, you know, region, you might, or in a very developed country, you know, you might be born in Telfair County, Georgia, where only 1/3 of the population actually has access to the internet. And this problem, you know, even before COVID times was really pernicious, but now as we see folks, you know, trying to, you know, students trying to learn online, access their jobs, access telehealth services, access online government services, this is really challenging. So there's sort of 3 different solutions that we can think about here. On the public side, we can expand FCC programs to improve connectivity. Jim Clyburn has put forward a $100 billion bill to help with rural connectivity. On the private side, we can lay cables and build satellite networks. So we want to make sure that we're not like, giving additional money to the Verizon and AT&Ts that have sort of failed to deliver on their promise for the last 2 or 3 decades. And on the nonprofit side, we can be providing Wi-Fi hotspots and digital education to families who are really in need. This one here was the most recent article that I wrote for American Inequality, which is about the cost of living and inequality. So as I was doing a lot of this inequality research, I sort of found that, a lot of the focus is sort of on only one side of the equation, which is this income piece, but you sort of can't look at income without looking at those costs that you incur. So, we often hear about, like that friend who went to go, work in San Francisco and got paid more as a result of moving there, because we know that that's a more expensive city, but we don't know how much more expensive it is. And so the chart sort of on the left looks at 4 different variables, which is the cost of healthcare, the cost of rent, the cost of groceries, and the cost of childcare is sort of the 4 big variables that kind of eat into one's income. And so what I found here was that the Bronx in New York is the effectively most expensive place to live in America, because households there make a median income of $42,000, but yet they're saddled with $66,000 of costs across their rent, their healthcare, their groceries, and their childcare. Because even as expensive as New York is, the folks in that parts of the Bronx, particularly the South Bronx, aren't making nearly enough to be covering those large costs that they're being saddled with. So, things that we can, solutions that we can focus on there are, helping folks lock in rates to cover their costs, that might be going up, and thinking about, more inflation adjusted cost of living for regions. There's so much debate around, the $15 minimum wage, but if you look in certain regions, like I just mentioned in the Bronx, the cost of living for a household with 2 children and both parents working is actually closer to $23, $24. So we want to make sure that we're actually orienting the debate around the right places.
Hey, Jeremy, is it okay if I interrupt you just for a second?
Please, yeah. Everyone's fine.
Yeah, so I apologize. There's actually a question in the chat, I believe just a couple slides back that I missed. I believe DLEC was asking, do you think online delivery helped?
I imagine that's referring to food deserts.
It's kind of what I'm guessing. DLEC, would you like to talk, or would you like him to clarify on that one? Oh, I meant with grocery. That's what he said. Okay.
I think yes, it has to some degree, but I think there's 2 challenges that emerge with like online grocery deliveries. I think one is that the radius that a lot of these online stores offer, and sort of if you are in a more rural region, those delivery services aren't really accessible to you. And second, sort of just the costs that are associated with those. Every penny counts, when you're living paycheck to paycheck. And so being able to afford one of those online services is really out of reach for a lot of folks, not to mention that they don't typically accept SNAP or EBT to basically allow you to sort of use your coupons or your food stamps through their services. And they sort of only have a set of grocery services that they actually allow. So it has, allowed folks to push out and get more access, because time is really valuable for a lot of these families too. So it helps in that sense, but the deliveries are often out of reach for folks.
We also have another question. Girish, if you'd like, I'm gonna allow you to talk if you want to ask your question. All right, go ahead. You're unmuted if you'd like to ask Jeremy your question. Audio might be cutting out. We'll come back to that one.
Hey.
Oh. All right, go ahead.
Sorry, it took me a little while to adjust my headset. My
yeah,
question
no worries.
with adaptive AI now sitting on top of massive amounts of geolocation data and getting better data to be put into 3D and with temporal visualizations. When it comes to equality or inequality across the globe, what use cases do you envision with this kind of advancement in technology that can impact economy and society? And I gave a few examples, either human mobility data or transport related, that could be logistics as well as human transport or autonomous, or access to anything. With this kind of a solution, what use cases do you think will bring some equality in the near future?
Yeah, so I think, some of the like technological and data advancements are allowing us to figure out where exactly folks are suffering the most and where we really need to be channeling a lot of our resources. A lot of these federal or even state policies that have been designed to, help folks in need, they're able to become much more targeted towards serving communities. But I think even if you start to look at, private companies and nonprofits as well, they're getting much more localized data saying, here's actually the region where public transportation is the worst, or where we're seeing really long commute times. And here's actually where we might be needing to set up more of our, scooters or dockless bicycles to make it easier for healthcare workers to, make their way into the office. And so I think as we get more and more information, I think, you sort of nailed, the piece on the head, which is that we want to make sure that we're actually using that to make sure that we're addressing some of these social challenges. Of
Thank you for that answer.
Of course. I will keep moving onward unless there are more questions.
Oh, actually, one more. So regarding Wi-Fi, to what extent do you think people are taking advantage of their phone's hotspots? Does the Wi-Fi access data you show include that? I think that's what the question was.
Yes, so the map here is just based off of broadband access. So that's, areas where ISPs have set up, hardwired connections to. This does not take into account how, cell phones, mobile phones have sort of changed internet access. But I think, they are using their phones a lot. I think that the challenge that, we see in No One Left Offline, the nonprofit that I'm a part of, is that it's really difficult for students and parents to complete a lot of their professional and educational needs just on their phones. And so while you do have, access on your phone, if you also don't have the device to sort of support that work, using your phone's hotspot without a laptop or something makes it quite challenging. So, in the Wi-Fi and internet connectivity and digital divide space, one acronym that's often used is ABCD, which is access, broadband connectivity, and devices. And without, sort of the three parts of ABCD, it doesn't really matter. And so you might have your mobile hotspot to work from, but without a tablet or a computer, it also doesn't really work. But the mobile phone data is much more difficult to get, in part because it's kept by Verizon and AT&T, unlike the FCC, which makes their broadband connectivity more public.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremy. I think that's all the questions for now.
Great. And I'm going to leave, around, 15, 20 minutes at the end as well for questions. So we can definitely dive into much more then as well. So here, this is around financial access and inequality, specifically looking at bank branches. So as you'll see, sort of the Southwest in America has some of the poorest access to bank branches in America. This data is taken from 168,450 bank branches that the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, tracks. And so this is saying there are very few brick and mortar locations for these folks. And the challenge of when those brick and mortar locations don't exist, we often find that communities turn towards payday lenders. So the map on the left here looks at the average interest rate that a payday lender will charge for a $300 1-month loan. So you can see, it's often in the range of 600%. And so you find yourselves, when you don't have some of these banks available to you, you get stuck in these spiraling debt traps. The areas are in gray are the 14 states in America that have outlawed payday lending and trying to help folks get out of this debt trap, but it's quite difficult. So around the solution space, as probably of you have many figured out, during COVID times, is that digital access to banking is a great solution here. But again, this connects to some of these interconnected forces where it's like, if your bank moves out of its brick and mortar location and tells you to log onto the app to access your finances there, but you don't have internet, then again, you're sort of in this, digital redlining space as they refer to it as well. And then the second solution is making it easier to create banks in low-income neighborhoods. So that's again using those NMTCs, those new market tax credits, to ensure that it's easier for banks to show up in regions, particularly when older populations prefer to use develop trust in those physical branches. Here, this article I focused on air pollution and inequality. And so what you'll see on the left is every single US factory that releases cancer-causing particles into the air, and each spike is based off of how many pounds of cancer-causing particles that they expel into the air. This is EPA data, and the EPA is, I think, one of the funniest government agency databases that I've interacted with, because they bury this data so incredibly deeply on their website, and if you Google it, you can't find it. You just need to follow a maze through their stuff, and then you can find basically all of these violations that these companies have and how much cancer-causing particles they're spewing into the air. So as you can see in this area in Elkhart, Indiana, kind of in the north there, is the most carcinogen releasing factories in the entire country. Elkhart, Indiana is also what's known as the RV capital of the world. So they produce a ton of RVs in the region, meaning there's lots of fiberglass and fiberglass particles that are floating through the air. And Elkhart, Indiana also has top 10% of lung cancer deaths in all America. So there's there's a strong relationship there between how much people are breathing in these pollutants and how quickly they're dying from lung cancer, particularly when they're sort of the only employers in the region. And then the chart on the right really just highlights, all those wildfires that we saw last year in Oregon and in California, and how many days with bad air quality, which is an EPA measurement there were in last year. And I imagine this year we will probably see, a similar chart again, if not more red across the region. So solutions we can explore here, creating fines, higher fines for some of these, pollutants, making it easier and more transparent to figure out who some of these, companies are, and then invest more in fighting fires, because, here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, even just last night, we saw, a lot of haze and smoke from, the wildfires across the country. So that's, doing work even before fire season to clear brush, as well as, reducing the reliance on inmate labor. Right now, California, 1 in 10 firefighters is a prisoner. They're paid about $1 to $2 an hour for their work, and making sure that we're, training more folks and not relying on this sort of perverse cycle of having folks in prison and relying on them to fight our fires in this climate change reality. So this is one of the few articles where I did not rely on a government database to gather information around this article, but this is around surveillance and inequality. So the chart on the left, I basically built a Python web scraper to figure out every Amazon Ring police partnership in America. So Amazon Ring are those smart doorbells that you've probably seen staring at you on the street. And the Ring police partnerships basically say that if there's been a crime, outside, the police are able to access the video footage from that if a partnership has been developed. So those are, size based on the number of requests that police have issued to Amazon Ring for data. As you can see, Chicago, is absolutely exploding with police Ring partnerships as well as requests in the last year. It's sort of the #1 region in America. They've also added 300,000, cameras to the streets alone, just through, public projects. So there's a lot of, sort of surveillance going on there, particularly in Chicago's South Side. So again, this is one of these, confounding forces that we see again. And then on the right side, we'd be remiss to talk about surveillance and video footage without also talking about facial recognition and some of the challenges that we're seeing there. So Fight for the Future collects data on where police have, by law been allowed to use facial recognition in airports, in background checks, in looking up ID photos and things like that. And so, get the combination of increased cameras as well as increased use of facial recognition sort of creates this quagmire for many communities. So solutions here are around increasing transparency, making it not so difficult for Amazon to hide some of this information, working to decrease bias in facial recognition software, particularly as it grows. And then think about what are some of the evidentiary standards for police data requests. You can go as high as, sort of the Fourth Amendment in here and talking about what the standards are there, or as low as what's the text that police need to be sending when they request from your home that they actually want the video surveillance footage, and knowing that you can opt out of that. Private schools and inequality is just, is such a ripe topic that people are really not talking enough about. And so this here, the Department of Education publishes data on the 34,576 private schools in America. And the chart on the right looks at, the relationship between household income and where those private schools actually are. So unsurprisingly, the wealthier your community is, the more private schools you are going to have. And this sort of just continues to reinforce certain cycles where, as the wealthier you are, the more you can opt out of a public school system and sort of get away from public schools. You look at places like New York City that has the most segregated schools in the entire country, and sort of the intense, wealth accumulation that we see there as well. Is sort of one of these indicators of regions where household income and private school access are related. But then there's folks like, in Phoenix, Arizona, we see, 45,000 students competing to get into 3 private schools alone, and thinking about the distribution of schools, where access is and where money is. So again, we can invest more in public schools and think about ways to reduce public school segregation.
Hey, Jeremy, we had a question from our audience. Do private schools, this is from David, do private schools include charter schools as well?
This does not include charter schools, though it does include religious schools.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, should be all the open questions.
Right. This one was a really devastating one to write about, which is about reading and inequality in America. So here, we uncovered that half of all US adults cannot read a book written at an 8th grade level. And even worse, 6th graders in the richest counties perform 4 grade levels above their peers in the poorest counties. That means that, if I live in a county where the median, in Loudoun County, I am reading as a 6th grader, reading at an 8th grade level, whereas someone, in Jackson County, Mississippi, a 6th grader is reading at a 4th grade level. And those gaps, for children are really difficult to overcome. So, one way to combat that is requiring reading licenses for teachers. So teachers aren't required to know how to actually teach other people to read in 19 states. So we can, permit that. Right now, parents are allowed to figure out who gifted students are, which is obviously, turns out to be very biased, and that white students tend to get picked much more often. And we can also deploy controlled choice integration programs, which are proven to be really successful in reducing school segregation. I am going to go through these quite quickly now, just because I want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for questions. Here is around homelessness and inequality. this is, again, was one of these challenges of what is the true data source. If you look, HUD will tell us that there's about 500,000 homeless people in America, but the Department of Education says that there's actually 1.5 million. It is incredibly difficult to measure homeless populations. America does this point in time estimate where the last week of January, a bunch of people with clipboards go out onto the streets in every single city in America and just count the number of homeless people they see, and that's how we measure it. Whereas the Department of Education does surveys on students and whether or not they're living in, you know, homeless situations, you know, in shelters or things like that. So this was a challenging data one to wrestle with, but also a really difficult, you know, social problem to dig into. And again, surprisingly, there's, you know, on the chart on the right, unsurprisingly, there's huge gaps between Black and white communities, in large part because of a long history in America of making it really difficult for Black people to accumulate wealth and become homeowners. These are just maps that I've created. So again, part of my process is I basically find a data source first and then figure out what the article will be afterwards. So, you know, these are maps on social services, Social Security income, SNAP, the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. This was another cool data set that I found from the US Patent Office, which is where in America are most people filing for patents. And so figuring out, like, given that probably people are equally distributed smart-wise across America, why do we see these really intense pockets of patent issuing? And, you know, perhaps trying to correlate that with other factors. And then this is sort of my brainstorm area of, you know, what are other articles that I want to be writing about and thinking through things. So people, you know, and I'd love to talk with all of you some more about this, but other ideas for articles to write, because there's no shortage of inequality topics out there. So American Inequality has been going great so far. We've got about 1,000+ email subscribers. I will drop the link in the chat. Nikki, let me know if that just went through. But I would love if you know, I'm really right now looking for other collaborators, folks to sort of help write articles with around this topic, as well as trying to help spread the word around how we can use data for social change. I have never used Reddit before, but I decided to post one of these articles once. I posted it at night. I woke up and it had about 13,500 upvotes when I woke up in the morning. And it reminded me of how crazy of a place the internet is. And people said some really crazy comments, but it was also, you know, fun to sort of get that traction there. And so we're definitely looking to grow this work moving forward. So again, you know, the takeaways: inequality is deeply intertwined. It's really important to focus on communities. And last, all is not lost. There are solutions that exist, but we need to think about the trade-offs that we make in driving those solutions forward. So with that, I would love to open up to questions about inequality topics, data visualization, and ways to encourage social change.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremy. I reposted that link. I think it just went to the panelists, so I made sure it went out to the panelists and attendees. Yeah, I think we'll open it up for questions. Feel free to dump them in either the chat or the Q&A, or you can also raise your hand and I'd be happy to call on you. Probably will take a couple minutes for some questions to come through. So I'll kind of start one off. So certainly hear a lot of inequality, or I guess how the US compares as far as like healthcare access inequality, but you brought up a lot of different domains that maybe we don't hear as much coverage on, like when it compares to international countries. So I'm curious to hear, like, how does the US compare in other areas that maybe we don't hear as much of? Maybe like one that I thought of would be like internet access. We don't really hear too much about how US compares. And I guess what are the takeaways that we can take from other countries that are perhaps doing a lot better in those areas as well?
Yeah, I think it's like, you know, there's a veil that we, you know, often put over about like the US as sort of being, you know, quite developed. And I think often when we, you know, start to like, you know, dig under the hood a little bit, we start to see some of these, you know, fractures emerge. And so I think part of this is just shedding light on where those issues might be. But I think, you know, I also try to draw from other areas, you know, and look from other countries around what they have done to, you know, particularly in the path forward section to combat some of these issues. So The next article that I'm working on now is on teenage pregnancy and inequality. And although the US has seen, declining teenage pregnancy rates, over the last, several decades, compared to other countries, the US is really not doing great. Even 15 years ago, the US had one of the highest teenage pregnancy rates among all of developed countries, and, increased access to contraceptives, to education, to sexual health education has really helped a lot in this. And in part, the US took a lot of, lessons from France in this space and sort of the way that they have been much more open in their regions. But, there are parts of the US in a lot of my research that make it really difficult to compare to other countries, in large part because of the US's deep history as it connects to race, and sort of how other countries often don't have sort of these additional challenges on top of that. And in this teen pregnancy article that I'm writing, this relationship between, really, this separation of church and state that we sort of have, but also sort of don't have, sometimes shows up in other countries, but doesn't. And so trying to figure out the right comparison groups often makes that apples to apples quite difficult.
Gotcha. I think we have another question that Rodney, I'm going to see if I can try to get you to allow you to talk. Give me 1 second. Looks like it's not showing up. Well, Rodney was asking, what kind of data are there on foster care? And is that a topic that you've looked into?
Yeah, the foster care data is actually pretty good on the private data management side, I guess I would call it. So the Annie Casey Foundation is really great for collecting data on that. One of the challenges is they always break it out by state, and so it's hard to get some of this county level or federal work there. But through some of the work that we've done at No One Left Offline, we've really focused on all that foster data and access there, in part because hotspots are so important for foster youth. But as I sort of had this chart up here, part of the reason I haven't even dug into some of these topics is because the data on these is a bit difficult. So access to abortion clinics, for example, is really hard. There's not really a good aggregated source, and figuring out distances is hard. Public transit similarly is hard to get these large aggregate measures of it. And so figuring out the source of truth is difficult. Not to mention the foster care challenge is similar to the homelessness one, which is just tracking these individuals can often be quite difficult. And so even once you do have, a great organization like the Annie Casey Foundation, those margins of errors can sometimes get pretty high.
Great. I'm going to let David speak and ask his question. David, you should be able to unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, we have been attempting to look at disparities in healthcare within a specific hospital. And I actually used a system to try to get information on counties, and it wasn't very satisfactory. I'm just wondering if there's any way of looking at data at the census tract level.
Yeah, so the census tract level is, I think one thing that has been a, silver lining, I guess, of COVID is that, we do see way more health data becoming much more granular, from the CDC, the Department of Health, things like that, though it's only really available for certain, traits. So for example, when I was writing the article on life expectancy and inequality, I was able to get CDC death records down to, sort of the census tract level. But when I was trying to write the article on air pollution and inequality, I was trying to look up, incidence of lung cancer, and the CDC doesn't, prepare it at that level. And so it very much so depends on sort of the variable, the health variable that you are trying to look at in order to get, much deeper. I think, these COVID trackers can get quite detailed, but again, it sort of depends on what you're trying to look at. Death rates we've been tracking for many years, but some of these newer measures, I'm unsure what you were trying to look at the hospital. But it sort of depends on those pieces there.
Awesome. It looks like there's one question. What is the logic? Can you go a little bit in depth of the logic behind surveillance and inequity?
Yeah, so here it is. So the impetus here was sort of tracking the long history in America of recognizing that certain communities are surveilled at much higher rates than others. Going back to 1963, we have now very detailed records on the FBI's wiretapping program of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and thinking about how we also segregate certain communities in ways to perhaps police them in different ways. And so I think this article sort of emerged in light of how we surveil or police or watch over certain communities at different rates than others, and also thinking about how technology can be both an enabler and sort of one of these challenging forces as well on top of that. And so here I was trying to say, we can, there's maybe 911 records that you can pull for certain communities. But if we think about, video surveillance as maybe being 911 calls in 3 dimensions, as maybe being this next iteration of policing, are we now still seeing those similar trends of how we surveil certain communities versus others? And so given that Amazon, Ring is now like exploding across these certain communities, and they also had this like direct tie between policing and surveillance, these explicit partnerships where they say, we have, created a contract with, Chicago's police department, with the New York police department, with Miami's police department to actually exchange data, then we can actually say, yes, in fact, policing is occurring more. We know how many requests that they have made in these regions to say that this is actually, these trends that we've been seeing since 1963 might actually still be persisting today.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I actually, until you brought that up, I never knew that was a partnership that existed between law enforcement and Amazon. How long have these programs been going on? Do you know that?
Yeah, so I think the first partnership was established in 2018 in Wisconsin, and now there's over 1,700 that have emerged. If you look at the curve of it, it was very steep, kind of in late 2019, early 2020, and it started to taper off a little bit. I think as law enforcement has been figuring out sort of what their strategies really ought to be as it relates to communities. But the relationships are definitely growing, and there's also all these incentives that Amazon has been pushing for law enforcement to say, we'll give you a $500 or $1,000 rebate on Ring doorbells if you can incentivize your community to sign them up. So
okay, yeah, I was not aware those partnerships existed. I'm gonna let Dilek ask a question live. I'll just ask to unmute. So if you want to unmute on your end and go ahead whenever you can.
Hello, thank you very much. I was wondering if you got any chance to take a look at voting behavior data and see any patterns there.
Yes, I did. And I actually deleted that slide from this beforehand because I thought that people were completely overwhelmed by just hearing about voting statistics in the last 2 years, but I now realize I should have kept that slide in.
Okay, because I was wondering if I missed that slide or, yeah, okay.
And I'm now kicking myself that I deleted it, but I have an article on voter suppression and inequality and looking at, voter turnout across regions as well as across different elections, and I've sort of built a time series here, not only for presidential, but also for midterm elections. And what was interesting about that article was how difficult it actually is to find voter turnout data, given how much we talk about voting in America, in part because there's a lot of controversy over who is actually an eligible voter. Is it just, someone who's older than 18? Because if so, then we can, use census information on that. But depending on who you ask, not everyone, who's older than 18 should actually be voting, right? And so it's, what is an eligible population? And so there's actually a ton of sophisticated math and scrubbing that needs to go into that question.
For
Did we lose her?
Give me one sec. Let me see.
oh, was I muted?
No, I apologize. I accidentally
Oh no,
saved
yeah,
it.
sure. Yeah, just for regarding data access. So I live in Nevada. I was doing something with voting, and I actually had to apply to the Secretary of State to have access to. I mean, you could get, but you may have to do some individual application to. I mean, there wasn't any difficulty in getting, but you just kind of have to apply and wait for it. And then you can see a lot of voting history at actually voter level. So just kind of wanted to throw it out there.
Yeah, the Harvard Kennedy School keeps a midterm, Congress, like voter eligibility database. The presidential one is sort of like still in development, and so that was sort of how I pulled the midterm data there. But yes, as I think you're well aware, different states do it sort of in different ways, and so it's trying to figure out how to make sure that the way we talk about one state and another state is actually symbiotic.
So I know we're kind of pushing right up against the hour. Jeremy, would you be able to take one more question from the audience?
Yeah, I'd love to.
We have a question from an anonymous attendee. So do you take into account margins of error in your analyses?
I sometimes do when doing some of the correlations. It's like something that I will look towards to basically make sure that when I say that there is this correlation, that the margin of error isn't like outside of a normal distribution, and so that's sort of how I think about it. But often, and I think this is in part because of the audience sort of who is digesting a lot of this work, that sort of level of analysis and that sort of level of consideration is something that when folks follow up with me over email, we can talk about, but I don't usually include that specifically in those articles.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeremy, again for hopping on. This was an incredibly engaging session. I'm super glad that we were able to have you on one of our seminars. As you can see, I'm sure Jeremy would be happy to get in touch with anyone who has follow-up questions. I'm sorry to the small handful of people that we weren't able to answer. I'm dropping my email address in the chat as well. Feel free to reach out to me if you'd like me to get you in touch with Jeremy, or reach out to Jeremy directly. But yeah, a few other things. Like I said, we do have another event coming up later this week. Dropping that link in the chat as well. But otherwise, thank you all so much for attending. And we will see you very soon at the next event. Take care, everyone.
Well, thanks so much.